Okay. Hello, 23 November. Weekly Marks, welcome. More Weekly Marks tomorrow at 3 p.m., assuming I wake up. Only thing that woke me up today was Yale beating Harvard in the game. Anyway, not that these things really matter. Today, we're going to skip slightly ahead on the one hand. On the other hand, it relates to what we've been looking at. That is the idea that rents are the real problem or are a symptom of the real problem. They give us a sign of the differences in wealth, of inequality. It's not just the amount of rent, but also as a price, but also the value of rent. And so all these things link together, I'd like to think anyway. And so what we've been looking at, of course, is trying to catch up with Andy Higginbottom. And I assume he's going to do a volume 3. So that's what we're going to look a little bit at. But the comparison is important. And to remind us about Higginbottom's analysis is that you can't sort of go 1, 2, 3 with the volumes of Marx. You have to sort of always look back, as he does with volume 2, looking back at volume 1. There is a interconnection that's important. And to deal with Marx is to, particularly with capital, is to look at all three. And what has pointed us in that direction, of course, is the Grundrisse, because the Grundrisse tries to deal with all three, even though it is a preliminary object. It allows us to get back to certain value problems, of which Marx might not call rent a value problem, but I would assert that it is. And this is Gemini's view. Marxian versus Ricardian theory of rent, a comparative analysis. Both Marx and Ricardo developed theories of rent, payment made to landowners for the use of their land. While their perspectives share some similarities, they also diverge significantly. Note, of course, that rent applies not simply to land, but to other things, and that Marx builds off of Ricardo's theory of rent, but he recall that Marx is making a critique of Ricardian theory, and it is always that kind of critique. That is, Ricardo's ideas become widely used, and Marx is going, well, that's just not the only way you do stuff. Ricardian theory of rent has differential rent. Ricardo primarily focused on differential rent, which arises from differences in land quality. More fertile land produces more surplus, allowing landlords to charge higher rents compared to less fertile land. There's Ricardo does laws of diminishing returns. As population grows and demand for food increases, less fertile land is brought into cultivation. This leads to higher production costs and consequently higher rents on more fertile land. Rent as a surplus. Rent is seen as a surplus extracted from the productive process resulting from differences in land quality. Note, of course, that in the feudal context, you have, multiple plots of land, and often there's rotation of crops. Also, there's the inclusion of the idea where you leave some land fallow to replenish it and also to develop it or whatever, and that you don't have anything grow on it, or you perhaps might even experiment with it. But the Marxian theory of rent includes differential rent, but also some concept which, for some Marxists like Deepakar Basu up at Amherst, he excludes the idea of absolute rent in the Marxian context. Marx introduced the concept of absolute rent, which is a payment made to landlords even for the least fertile land. And, he assumes this is kind of a zero, or he nullifies this, Basu does. This rent is extracted through the capitalist system's exploitation of labor. Now, I'm not going to argue with Basu on this. I just think it just makes his math easier. But, you know, it is there in the original. And you sort of have to sort of kind of think about why he did that. Differential rent 1 and 2. Marx further developed Ricardo's concept of differential rent, dividing it into two forms. Differential rent number 1, similar to Ricardo's, it arises from differences in land, fertility, and location. Differential rent 2, this form is specific to capitalist agriculture and results from capital improvements to land, such as drainage, irrigation, fertilization, etc. Landlords can charge higher rents for land with these improvements, which all sounds pretty natural. And then, of course, there is the question of rent's significance as a form of surplus value, and that in fact does signify surplus value. Marx argued that rent is a form of surplus value, value created by workers, but appropriated by capitalists and landlords. Now, of course, this is problematic in a larger industrial context, particularly when agriculture becomes industrialized, however you want to think about it. And then it has other complicated issues that, you know, is the state cross-subsidizing the agriculture because of subsidies? And, you know, these are things that will still come up. Certainly they still do exist. So there are key differences. Blah, blah, blah. In conclusion, while both theories acknowledge that rent is a payment made to landowners, their underlying explanations differ significantly. Ricardo's theory emphasizes natural differences in land quality, while Marx's theory highlights the economic and social factors that contribute to rent, particularly the capitalist mode of production. Marx's analysis provides a more comprehensive view of rent, incorporating both economic and social dimensions. See, it's for Marx, it's a question also of, you know, certain other kinds of inputs, capital inputs. This is the kind of the basic thing where you think about, well, tractors do something, plow does something. Killing off kulaks does something. So you can see that all these kinds of things can happen. And that's kind of where we are. There are links here that allow for further analysis of this. And we're going to look at the first form of differential rent. And that is differential rent 1 in a second here. And so we're skipping ahead. That is to volume 3, part 6. Probably no different than what David Harvey does in terms of his treatment of capital. But also, I think we want to think about other kinds of ideas about this. So let's just sort of read through this first. We'll eventually and probably soon come back to this. But this is Marx's take on Ricardo. Ricardo is quite right. This is chapter 39, volume 3, part 6, transformation of surplus profit into ground rent. Rent is always the difference between the produce obtained by the employment of two equal quantities of capital and labor. Now, he means differential rent, for he assumes that no other rent but differential rent exists. This is kind of Basu's move. He should have added on equal areas of land insofar as a matter of ground rent and not surplus profit in general. In other words, surplus profit, if normal and not due to accidental occurrences in the circulation process, is always produced as a difference between the products of two equal quantities of capital and labor. And this surplus profit is transformed into ground rent when two equal quantities of capital and labor are employed on equal areas of land with unequal results. Moreover, it's by no means absolutely necessary for this surplus profit to arise from the unequal results of equal quantities of invested capital. The various investments may also employ unequal quantities of capital. Indeed, this is generally the case, but equal proportions, for example, 100 pounds of each, produce unequal results. That is, their rates of profit are different. This is the general prerequisite for the existence of surplus profit in any sphere of capital investment. The second prerequisite is the transformation of this surplus profit into the form of ground rent, of rent in general as a form distinct from profit. It must be investigated in each case when, how, under what conditions this transformation takes place. Ricardo was also right in the following observation, provided it is limited to differential rent. Whatever diminishes the inequality in the produce obtained on the same or on new land tends to lower rent, and whatever increases that inequality necessarily produces an opposite effect and tends to raise it. However, among these causes are not merely the general ones, that is, fertility and location, but also, number one, the distribution of taxes, depending on whether it operates uniformly or not. The latter is always the case when, as in England, it's not centralized, and when the tax is levied on land, but not on rent. So automatically distinguishes between the two. Number two, the inequalities arising from a difference in agricultural development in different parts of the country, since this is a line of production, owing to its traditional character, evens out with more difficulty than manufacture. And number three, the inequality in distribution of capital among capitalist tenants. Since the invasion of agriculture by the capitalist mode of production, transformation of independently producing peasants into wage workers is in fact the last conquest of this mode of production. These inequalities are greater here than in any other line of production. So, having made these preliminary remarks, I will first present a brief summary of the characteristic features of my analysis in contradistinction to that of Ricardo, etc. This won't be that long. I did abbreviate this because there are lots of little numbers that he puts in volume 3. We shall first consider the unequal results of equal quantities of capital applied to different plots of land of equal size. So in the case of unequal size, results calculated on the basis of equal areas. The two general causes of these unequal results, quite independent of capital, are, number one, fertility. With reference to this first point, it will be necessary to discuss what is meant by natural fertility of land and what factors are involved. Number two, location, the location of the land. This is the decisive factor in the case of colonies and in general determines the sequence in which plots of land can be cultivated. Furthermore, it's evident that these two different causes of differential rent, that is fertility and location, may work in opposite directions. A certain plot of land may be very favorably located and yet, be very poor in fertility and vice versa. This circumstance is important, for it explains how it is possible that bringing into cultivation the land of a certain country may equally well proceed from the better to the worse land as vice versa. Finally, it's clear that the progress of social production in general has, on the one hand, the effect of evening out differences arising from location as a cause of ground rent, by creating local markets and improving locations by establishing communication and transportation facilities. On the other hand, it increases the differences in individual locations of plots of land by separating agriculture from manufacturing and forming large centers of production on the one hand, while relatively isolating agricultural districts on the other. For the present, however, we shall leave this point concerning location out of consideration and confine ourselves just to fertility. Aside from climatic factors, etc., the difference in natural fertility depends on the chemical composition of the topsoil. That is, on its different plant nutrition content. However, assuming the chemical composition and natural fertility in this respect to be the same for two plots of land, the actual effective fertility differs depending on whether these elements of plant nutrition are in a form which may be more or less easily assimilated and immediately utilized for nourishing the crops. Hence, it will depend partly upon chemical and partly upon mechanical developments in agriculture to what extent the same natural fertility may be made available on plots of land of similar natural fertility. Fertility, although an objective property of the soil, always implies an economic relation, a relation to the existing chemical and mechanical level of development in agriculture, and therefore changes with this type of development. whether by chemical means, such as the use of certain liquid fertilizers on stiff clay soil and calcination on heavy clay soils, or mechanical means, such as special plows for heavy soils. The obstacles which made a soil of equal fertility actually less fertile can be eliminated. Drainage also belongs under this heading. Or even the sequence in types of soil taken under cultivation may be changed thereby, as was the case, for instance, with light sandy soil and heavy clay soil at a certain period of development in English agriculture. This shows once again that historically, in the sequence of soils taken under cultivation, one may pass over from more fertile to less fertile soils, as well as vice versa. The same results may be obtained by an artificially created improvement in soil composition or by a mere change in agricultural methods. Finally, the same result may be brought about by a change in the hierarchical arrangement of the soil types due to different conditions of the subsoil, as soon as the latter likewise begins to be tilled and turned over into top layers. This is in part dependent on the employment of new agricultural methods, such as the cultivation of fodder grass, and in part on the employment of mechanical means, which either turn the topsoil over into top layers, mix it with topsoil, or cultivate the subsoil without turning it up. All these influences upon the differential fertility of various plots of land are such that, from the standpoint of economic fertility, the level of labor productivity, in this case, the capacity of agriculture to make the natural soil fertility immediately exploitable, a capacity which differs in various periods of development, is as much a factor in so-called natural soil fertility as its chemical composition and other natural properties. We assume then the existence of a particular stage of development in agriculture. We assume, furthermore, that the hierarchical arrangement of soil types accords with this stage of development, as is, of course, always the case for simultaneous capital investments on different plots of land. Differential rent may then form either an ascending or descending sequence. For although the sequence is given for the totality of actually cultivated plots of land, a series of movements leading to its formation has invariably taken place. So that's, thinking at the level of differential rent 1. Now let's think about differential 2. There's a lot more in that chapter. Just thinking about kind of the premises make our introduction easier. Capital Volume 3, Part 6, Transformation of Surplus Profit into Ground Rent, Chapter 40, second form of differential rent, that is differential rent 2. Thus far, we consider differential rent only as the result of varying productivity of equal amounts of capital invested in equal areas of land of different fertility. So that differential rent was determined by the difference between the yield from the capital invested in the worst rentless soil and that from the capital invested in the superior soil. We had side-by-side capitals invested in different plots of land so that every new investment of capital signified a more extensive cultivation of the soil, and expansion of cultivated area. In the last analysis, however, differential rent was, by its nature, merely the result of a different productivity of equal capitals invested in land. But can it make any difference if capitals of different productivity are invested successively in the same plot of land or side by side in different plots of land, provided the results are the same? You can see how systematic that could be. So it is a critique on that, in that sense, of Ricardian theory. That is, the quantity of land is limited, and so is it's productive, and it's not uniform. If the superior land will not support the population, recourse must be made to inferior lands, and the produce is thus raised at different costs. The differential advantage of the superior land over the inferior gives rise to economic rent. The amount of rent is determined by the degree of differences in land productivity. Now, what Marx is trying to say is, well, that's one way of looking at it. The other way is, of course, there are technical improvements that occur, or more importantly, for Marx, application of labor, differential labor. Who's getting exploited more? So on the subject matter of Ricardo's theory of rent, this is a different article. According to Ricardo, economic rent is enjoyed by land only. Rent arises due to the niggardliness of nature. According to Ricardo, rent is producer's surplus. Rent is paid for the use of land whose supply is completely inelastic. Now, Ricardo's theory is based on the following assumptions. So, the supply of land is fixed. Supply of land is inelastic. That is, its minimum supply price is zero in the sense that its supplies are either available or positive whether any payment is made or not. Something happens. And number two, law of diminishing marginal product operates. And Marx sort of agrees with this, but doesn't fully address this. And this is, that point where, if Marx had been teaching, had a faculty appointment somewhere, he might have actually started thinking about the math. Number three, Malthus's theory of population is operative. In brief, this theory states that a country's population has the tendency to double within 30 to 35 years. And number four, land, being a gift of nature, has no cost of production. In view of this, rent does not enter the cost of production or price. Ricardo believed that price influences rent and not the other way. So we have some differences that occur, particularly in the further abstraction. I think the point that Marx is trying to make is, well, that's one way of looking at it, but the reality, of course, is that we think broader than that, and that there are other things that might, in fact, become rent-like. He does sort of suggest all of that, and that rent's relation to the development of profit or surplus value is, kind of some relation to that. So according to rent, according to Ricardo, there are two types of rent: a differential rent, which we saw Marx sort of address, and then a scarcity rent, that land is just simply limited. And the conversion of the land is something we don't want to think about, or, that just doesn't work for my theory, because then you have to sort of get into the thing about, well, how do you estimate labor costs and the transformability of machines and labor and stuff like that. And Ricardo doesn't quite go there, even though he should. So scarcity rent. Let's assume that land available for cultivation is fired and is therefore completely inelastic. Somebody threw a match in, whatever. Labor is the variable input. Assume that marginal product of the variable input labor diminishes as population tends to rise. Demand for land rises. So according to Ricardo, rent must arise since supply of land is fixed in relation to demand. Land being perfectly inelastic in supply, that is, its price, that is rent. Ricardo thinks price and rent are identical in this context, is essentially demand determined. Consequently, prices of corn, that is, corn is more generic in this context, wheat, whatever, rise, and grain, for example, rise, and surplus from land emerges. Such surplus is Ricardo's scarcity rent. Land is fixed and homogeneous in quality for Ricardo. Land is used for the production of a single crop, corn, grain, whatever. To explain Ricardo's concept of scarcity rent, we use the following diagram, and this is, the way in which you would explain it in a standard microclass. Panel A of the figure 6.5 shows the equilibrium of the agricultural farm, while panel B shows the same for the market. And in micro, you would explain that, okay, this is how costs change and demand changes in terms of farm to market output. And it's all pretty easy here. You see a marginal increase. You see that rent is the increase in value or income revenue from a raise in price relative to demand, increased demand, etc. And that all seems like it all connects, and that's good, and et cetera, et cetera. So, the market demand changes, of course, the demand curve when you have increases in population. So there's a Malthusian thing, and therefore you have price differentials that occur from there. And I don't want to get too far into that because people would just forget all of the little lines and stuff. Anyway, the volume of rent is thus therefore determined by the price of the product. Thus, rent is a price-determined cost, but not price-determining cost. This sort of rent has emerged due to the inelasticity of the supply of land. Since land is fixed and supply is, its price is demand determined. That just makes it perfectly easy. But the fact is, it's just not quite like that. And they have different effects. Population effects are much more problematic, of course, because it takes longer, 9 months, to produce kids or whatever. And of course, the kids have to grow and blah, blah, blah. And so it's not as equal. Space and time is different in that sense. So under differential rent, under Ricardo, it's quite likely that all lands are not of uniform quality. Truly speaking, lands are not homogeneous in quality. Some lands are much more fertile than others. And so for Ricardo, such differences in fertility or productivity of land result in the emergence of economic rent. This happens naturally. This sort of economic rent has been described by Ricardo as differential rent. Again, some lands for the purpose of building a shopping mall or office are available in excellent location that warrants a higher price. And you can see how easy it is to step from a Ricardo discussion on agricultural land to location theory and a kind of mechanical move to say, well, location counts, and it is prices can help determine that, and location is sort of a factor, but not sort of a factor. For the sake of simplicity, we assume that there are three grades of land, where between X and Z. In panel D, market equilibrium has been shown. Product price is OP. The farm accepts this price. Ricardo assumed that a cultivator would produce first in superior, that you always demand superior quality of land, and then you would use next best land, and et cetera, et cetera. And so in a system which has marginal land, which has good rents, bad rents, and then no rents, you can see the differential at work. So price determines cost in this particular matter. Is that the only index you have of this is to establish it by, well, it's got to be demand driven. Doesn't have all these other factors going on. We can already just rely on the numbers in that particular context. Well, Marx's view of that is a little bit different because there are limitations to Ricardo's theory of rent. And yet, it's how it's taught is in location theory. You tend to try to make everything uniform because then the math works better and it's easier to explain. And there's an entire body of location theory that essentially is very mechanical about these matters and tries to say, well, we just scale it up this way. And let's assume that the surface of the land is more even, so you can put cells in each, you can divide up land into a sort of cellular matrix, and it just makes it so much easier. Well, the reality, of course, is that land, very little land, appears that way, exists that way, and Ricardo didn't want to get into those messy matters. So Marx doesn't really either, but he's trying to tackle the notion of capital at the same time. That is, well, we can change a lot of that because we can either get people or machines to help change the land. Limitations of Ricardo's theory of rent. Ricardo's theory of rent is subject to criticism. First, it may be objected that land does not have any original and indestructible powers. The power of land can be changed in a scientific way. This is why, Marx was sort of concerned with soil science in his later years. It is unrealistic to assume that land has only one use. Instead, land has alternative uses, multiple uses even. It can be used for a variety of purposes. As Ricardo assumed, that land has only one use, its supply is completely inelastic. A particular plot of land may be used for the production of either wheat or jute. As land has alternative uses, the supply of land to a particular use cannot be addressed as perfectly inelastic. Number three, lands are never cultivated in descending order of fertility as was assumed by Ricardo. Actually, cultivation is pursued in accordance with the location of land and other reasons, of course. And four, the concept of marginal or no rent land is not found in reality. Number five, according to Ricardo, rent is specific to land. In other words, rent arises only in the case of land. Now, but modern economists have demonstrated that rent arises not only in the case of land, but in all kinds of other factors of production. That is, you sign a lease or a long-term contract agreement for your new computer numeric control machine, et cetera, and there is rent involved. Number four, finally, Ricardo has shown that rent is determined by the price of grain. That is to say, in Ricardo's theory, rent does enter into the cost of production. Now, this Ricardian idea becomes true if we consider the supply of land from the viewpoint of the economy as a whole. If supply of land is considered from the viewpoint of a firm or an industry, rent then determines price, and hence rent will enter cost of production. So obviously, hopefully, you'll see that these numeric kind of conditions are relatively limited, and now they're limited in order to get the example to work out right, but does it apply to reality? And that's part of, Marx's little critique here. He's going, well, it's not as abstract or uniform as you claim that it might be, and all these conditions are problematic and become even more problematic when you consider that what you're producing is usually a much more complex commodity. That is, for example, in the case of farm animals, farm animals also, thrive on what the land is, and there is a differential between the number of things you've got out there eating the land and things that you're growing on the land, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a lot more complicated, and they're not quite identical. Although it is quite fascinating to have a differential, means of doing those same things. That is, getting your herd of goats or sheep out there to, cut down grass or whatever instead of using a mower, etc. So their criticisms assumed fix, not realistic, fertility, blah, blah, blah. So conclusion, in spite of the various shortcomings of the Ricardian theory, cannot be discarded, as Stoney and Haig remarked. Now, the concept of transfer earnings helps to bring the simple Ricardian theory of rent into closer relation with reality. So the simple version, of course, of the Ricardian version of land is to, superior and inferior land, to assume in some ways that there is a no rent land. Now, what's useful or interesting in the more modern case, contemporary case, is that you could actually create a neural network, and I don't recommend this to anybody necessarily, but it's interesting that Ricardian rents are included in a model here, a very recent model, of how you create a innovation ecosystem of the dairy industry cluster based on machine learning and improved neural networks. So if you assume a certain degree of artificiality or whatever, homogeneity, and you presume that Ricardian rents dominate, it's not a bad assumption. It's just that I think reality is probably a little bit different. And but in order to get your neural network, your AI neural machine learning network to work out, you have to assume Ricardian rents. So this is a current version of how can you apply Ricardian rents to a dairy industry. You'll note that here there's no inclusion of the government subsidies, although there is a government preference and a intra-cluster transaction cost and a bunch of other things, but not something that has that other whole subsidy element that is built into the function of a dairy industry and the construction of a dairy industry. So um, that's my little presentation here today, is that, you can compare Marxian rents with Ricardian rents, but you can see that Marx is taking this a little bit further, and that even in the most contemporary case, that Ricardian rents are, while a nice idea, there are other neo-Ricardian elements I think that are important to think about. And in fact, I'm not saying that a person building an entire neural AI network on Ricardian rents is a bad thing. It's just that it's a limited, let's say, a limited model that it's easier to do, but is, easy better, I guess. So that's kind of my little thing today on rent, which I will probably do a little bit more on tomorrow. And let me see if there are any. Well, it looks like there's commentary. No one trying to grow tulips in the desert, indeed. Uh, yes, manifest destiny. Ha, ha. Yes, fertility of land depends on more than just the land. Depends on what you're growing. This land is my land. And I always defer to Nancy in terms of actual horticultural health. And man with a hoe is not the same as a wheat thresher. I had a friend of mine. It was Halloween, and he decided that he would show up as whatever it is, Vuillard or Monet's Man with a Hoe, and he had a garden hoe with him, but it was that little linguistic joke, and he's a black guy, so it was just amusing. I got the joke immediately. No one else did, but so you're a man with a hoe. Are you looking for a hoe? Anyway, I like that job. That was a fun job. But anyway, that's what comes from working in the Midwest. Anyway, all right, that's my little joke there, and I'll have a lot more to say. I introduced a thing a while ago about ground rent, and that there's a difference between, of course, ground rent that you charge for a particular plot and let's say you build a building on it. You obviously have lots of other kind of rents at work. So that's kind of the point that one makes, the difference between, or how inclusive is ground rent to whatever is built upon it. And this relates to what Marx is obviously more sensitive to, and that is the idea of property or ownership of these different elements, that the person who owns the ground rent is not the same person as the person who is sort of owning the building rent that is on top of it. And then, of course, there are other layers of the question of the rent: deferred rent, blah, blah, blah rent, contractual rent, development costs, transfer of rights to further development, blah, 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 blah. And so rent is a very complicated thing in a modern context, whereas it was a lot less complicated in Marx's day. And Marx wasn't that. Marx, when he talks about differential rent, is anticipating that this is kind of what the problem is. Marx had his couple of kids, and he, in there in Camden Town or wherever the hell he was, and you kind of worry about that stuff, or you think about it anyway. I think that was sort of what perhaps occurred to his mind, and as well, the issue of soil fertility being a major differential in the terms of colonies, and the idea of differential development in colonial settings, that is India, Russia, things that Marx was concerned about, the Caribbean, Marx in his later years worried about these kind of matters. He wrote about them. That's kind of the literature that has yet to be sort of plumbed by a lot of people. They just weren't focused as much on, partially because people were going, oh, okay, well, this is an interesting artifact of colonial history, but we're more worried about now, whether we're going to overthrow the government or not, and this knowledge is less interesting to us when we really just simply need to seize the power and redistribute the land, which I think in the Latin American context is why you see very little literature on sort of advanced rent problems in the later volumes of Marx in sort of development literature, which there should be and there will be, I think, as people think more about the further aspects of Russia. And of course, Marx's interest in Russia is because it has such a large peasantry at the time, and it is monarchically hierarchical and ripe for a kind of revolution. And you can see how in his later life you're going, oh well, there's this huge thing over there and it's huge, and it's run by this one family, and geez, you'd think the peasantry would rise up, and then of course that's why Marx in his later life wanted to learn Russian, the Russian language, etc. And you can see why Lenin would go, oh yeah, we can do this. This can be done, and should be done, etc. So anyway, that's so much for 19th century history. That's pretty much what I have to say. If there's no other major interventions or commentary, I will shut the live stream off, or maybe I don't have power of the live stream. No, I do. And
Well,
yes,
the that Marx came after Ricardo, he had the benefit of that.
yes.
And, of course, I'm all on board with, Marx's sort of abstracting this. And, to me, there's subtleties in there that Ricardo just kind of paved over.
Yep.
And so was there somebody after Ricardo and after Marx sort of made this criticism of Ricardo that then had response? I'd be curious to, I probably wouldn't place much credence in it, but what the response to this criticism is.
Well, it doesn't tread the same water. Let's just put it that way. The Marx is sort of working in a margin, and other matters take precedence. That is, capitalism is just sort of doing its thing, and issues about rent relative to farms becomes less and less important. I just, I don't mean to diminish it. It's just simply that no one wants to tackle it. There's not a lot of literature, theoretical literature anyway, written on this. So this Ricardian notion, as you can see, Ricardian prices still are important to some people, even at the level of machine learning. I'm going, what the hell, man? So anyway, Ricardian a Ricardian theory makes it easier, but you can see that after the turn of the century, with the failures of major economies, you can see people like Sraffa in the 20s, I guess it is, 30s, thinking about, well, maybe we should rethink this Ricardo thing and its relation to commodities. And so, a couple of people fiddling around at Cambridge are sort of working with this idea and trying to make it better. Also seeing at the same time that farm reform doesn't quite work in the Russian context. Whatever. Things move slowly. Let's just put it that way. Sraffa brings this up again. I mean, this is what Sraffa is about, is that, well, let's take this Ricardian model and let's think about, well, what is it that Ricardo thinks about commodities? And I thinks about them in a somewhat linear and singular way, but how is it that we can sort of apply math to all this sort of stuff, and that's what Schroff is about. Maybe we can get this to work a little better. And so there's an entire line of inquiry relative to capital that becomes reworked and ultimately becomes we've skipped over several decades, but it ultimately becomes the Cambridge capital controversy.
Oh.
Thought about Marx, moves slowly, mainly because of commies. Don't do that commie stuff, dude. That sort of thing.
Yeah, when I was talking to my friend earlier today, I kind of felt a little bit of some of that, communism is a boogeyman kind of thing coming from him.
Well, there are totalitarian necessities that come from it. It's built into it, dictatorship of the proletariat, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't, after Hitler, dictators, sort of get a bad name. Some people only think their dictatorships can last one day.
Well,
Anyway.
he